The night our train broke down in the middle of nowhere. I thought it would just be another delay. But then he showed up, quiet, focused, and completely unexpected. I was the one driving the engine, but he was the one who got it. And me, running again. The hum of the train had always been a kind of comfort to Milo. After almost 2 decades on the rails, he had memorized every shift in sound, every subtle vibration beneath his boots. The rhythm of the wheels over the tracks was like a second heartbeat, one he trusted more than most people. His days were simple, predictable, and wrapped in the mechanical certainty of scheduled stops and long stretches of quiet landscape. That day had begun like any other: early coffee in a chipped mug, a check of the control panel, and a nod to the conductor before departing the depot. The late autumn morning air was crisp, and the low sun painted the steel tracks in a wash of gold. He welcomed the silence, only interrupted occasionally by radio calls or the distant clatter of freight behind him. Milo didn't mind solitude. In fact, he preferred it. Somewhere beyond the pine-lined edge of a remote stretch, that solitude broke. An alert blinked red on the panel. Then came the slowing, the unnatural lurch, and finally, the stop. Dead stillness. The engine wasn't responding. Milo ran a series of diagnostics from the console, fingers moving with the practiced calm of someone who had done this before, but something didn't add up. Whatever had gone wrong, it wasn't going to be solved with a few button presses. He sighed, rubbing a hand across his jaw as he radioed the central line. They responded with a name: Thatcher, a field mechanic station nearby, newly transferred from a different route. Milo didn't recognize it. He rarely remembered names that didn't matter to his work. The delay meant they'd be stuck here for a while. No movement, no passengers on this cargo run, just trees stretching in every direction and the soft whine of cooling steel. He stepped down from the cabin to wait near the side of the engine, pacing slowly. The sky was already dimming into shades of blue-gray, and the air grew colder by the minute. Every sound echoed more than it should have. Leaves crunched somewhere in the distance, and then came the low rumble of an approaching service truck. Thatcher arrived just past dusk. He moved with quiet efficiency, unloading a worn metal case and setting it down with a practiced thud. His uniform bore the same dust and grease Milo remembered from his early years before promotion pulled him out of repair work. There was something steady about Thatcher, shoulders squared, steps measured, like he carried his own kind of rhythm inside him. Their introduction was brief. Milo offered a curt nod, and Thatcher returned it without unnecessary words. It was a silent agreement between working men who knew the job mattered more than small talk. While Thatcher examined the undercarriage, Milo remained close, watching with quiet interest. Tools clinked and scraped as the mechanic moved with precision, slipping between shadows cast by the train's length and the beam of his portable light. There was something oddly reassuring about his focus. The way he paused to listen, adjusted, then moved again. He didn't fumble. He didn't rush. Minutes turned into an hour, then two. As the night deepened, a chill set in. Milo lit a small lantern from the emergency kit and offered it to Thatcher without words. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, a brief, unintentional touch that sent a ripple of awareness through the older man, one he quickly dismissed. They didn't speak much. Occasionally, Thatcher mumbled something about pressure gauges or valve systems, but mostly he worked in silence, and Milo observed with arms crossed and breath clouding in the air. Time stretched differently out here, away from schedules and platforms. The mechanical failure had slowed everything down, not just the train but the world around it. In that forced pause, Milo found himself seeing more clearly. The trees didn't just line the tracks. They stood sentinel, swaying softly. The stars above felt closer, unobstructed by city light. And Thatcher, in his quiet competence, seemed less like a stranger and more like part of the landscape itself. There was no grand moment, no dramatic exchange. Just a calm understanding growing beneath the surface, like frost slowly settling across steel. Eventually, Thatcher straightened from beneath the engine, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked tired, the kind of tired that doesn't just come from physical work, but from carrying too much for too long. Milo recognized that kind of weariness. He saw it every time he looked in the mirror. They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by the dark and the cold. The train remained still, but something inside Milo had shifted, like a piece of track nudging out of its groove. He didn't know what the next hours would bring. He didn't even know if Thatcher would finish the repairs tonight. But for the first time in a long while, Milo wasn't entirely sure he wanted the train to start moving again so soon. The quiet stretched between them, thick like the cold settling into Milo's coat. The lantern flickered softly nearby, casting long shadows that danced across the steel skin of the train. Thatcher leaned against the side of the engine, his shoulders rising and falling in a steady rhythm as he caught his breath. Milo remained by the steps, one boot resting on the metal rung, arms still crossed, but no longer in defense, just out of habit. The train wouldn't be moving tonight. That much was clear. A replacement part had to be brought in from a depot miles away, and it wouldn't arrive until the morning. Central had confirmed it. Milo acknowledged it with a brief nod when the message came through his radio, but inside, something stirred. He wasn't disappointed. Strangely, he welcomed the delay. They would have to wait here until dawn, just the two of them, miles from the nearest town. It was the kind of scenario that would have irritated him any other day. But now it felt like an odd sort of gift. Thatcher stood quietly, his posture relaxed, but his eyes alert, scanning the sky like it held answers. Milo studied him under the lantern's dim light. There was an ease in the way Thatcher existed in silence. No need to fill the space with meaningless words. That was rare, and Milo appreciated it more than he could admit. Inside the cab, the small heater hummed with low effort. Milo eventually gestured toward it, not saying anything, but making it clear that Thatcher was welcome. The mechanic nodded once and followed him in. The cab was warmer than the outside, though the air still carried a metallic bite. Milo poured them both lukewarm coffee from the emergency thermos. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold. They sat in the narrow space behind the control panel, the world outside reduced to distant shadows and the occasional creak of wind against the train's frame. For a while, they drank in silence. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It had weight, but not pressure. It wrapped around them like the soft hum of the train had done for years. Milo found himself stealing glances at the way Thatcher held the cup with both hands, the slow movement of his jaw as he thought through something unspoken. Eventually, Thatcher broke the silence, not with a story or question, but with a statement that hung in the air longer than it should have. "It's different out here." Milo nodded. He understood without needing explanation. The distance from noise, from people, from expectation, it shifted things. Out here, stripped of distraction, there was only the moment and whoever shared it with you. The heater clanked softly. The lantern outside still flickered, casting its faint glow into the windows like a distant lighthouse. Milo leaned back slightly, letting his body relax for the first time that day. The tension in his shoulders, the constant alertness of responsibility, it faded slowly in Thatcher's presence. There was something about being near someone who didn't require explanation, who didn't poke or pry. Milo had spent years hiding behind routines, using work as a shield. He knew how to be dependable, respected, invisible. But tonight, in the quiet warmth of the stalled train, he felt seen, not because of what he did, but because of who he was when no one else was watching. They didn't talk much after that. Words would have broken something fragile between them. At one point, Thatcher reached over and adjusted a stray cable under the console, his hand brushing Milo's sleeve as he did. The touch was brief, casual, but Milo didn't move away. He didn't stiffen or deflect. He just let it happen. Later, they sat closer than before, not out of necessity, but quiet agreement. Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere far beyond the trees, an owl called out, and the wind shifted slightly. Milo glanced at Thatcher's profile, softened by the low light. He looked tired but at peace. There was a gravity to him that made Milo's chest ache. A man who had seen too much and said too little, who fixed things others couldn't and bore the silence like armor. Milo didn't know what this night would mean by morning. He didn't expect answers or even clarity. But for the first time in a long time, He didn't feel alone in the dark. And that, in its own quiet way, was everything. The hours moved slowly, marked only by the faint ticking of the cab's control panel and the muted rustle of wind through the trees outside. Milo hadn't planned to spend his night in the cab with a near stranger. Yet here he was, sitting across from Thatcher in a quiet that had grown so natural, it felt like they'd known each other far longer than a few hours. Somewhere between the silence and the hum of the heater, the atmosphere began to shift. Not sharply, not in any way either of them could name, but gradually, like how the temperature drops before sunrise or how the weight of something unsaid begins to press more heavily on the air. Thatcher spoke again, his voice low and even, barely disturbing the stillness. He didn't talk about engines or faulty wiring this time. Instead, he shared a memory, something personal, a detail about a move that hadn't gone the way he expected, a job that had ended too early, a person he had almost let himself care for but didn't. Milo didn't respond at first. He just listened. He had always been good at reading between the lines. What Thatcher didn't say mattered just as much as what he did. The way he looked away slightly as he talked. The way he tapped his thumb against the paper cup in his hands. All of it was familiar. Milo had done the same things for years, hid behind facts, beneath uniforms, inside trains that never stopped long enough for anyone to ask questions. When the story ended, Thatcher didn't look for comfort or reaction. He just exhaled and leaned back in the narrow seat, letting the words fall away like dust shaken from a jacket. Milo found himself wanting to say something that would matter. Not to fill the silence, but to meet it. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if testing each word for weight. About the life he'd built around timetables and radio signals. About the way the rhythm of the tracks had always been more dependable than the people in his life. About how he had once let someone in years ago and how it had nearly unraveled everything he had worked for. Thatcher didn't interrupt. He listened the same way Milo had listened to him, with quiet understanding and no judgment. It made the confession easier, even if it felt strange to hear his own voice admitting things he hadn't said aloud in years. They were two men shaped by solitude, by long hours and unspoken rules, by the quiet resignation that came with putting responsibility above self. They weren't dramatic or impulsive or naive. They had seen too much to chase things blindly. But even still, something real was forming between them. Not fast, not loud, but steady. Intentional. The heater clicked off briefly, and the temperature dipped. Without thinking, Milo shifted slightly, and Thatcher did the same. Their shoulders touched, barely, but neither of them moved away. Outside, the night was deep and unchanging. Inside the cab, the smallest gestures had started to feel monumental. A glance that lasted too long. A sigh that said more than words. The subtle lean of one body toward another. They didn't speak of attraction or want or anything so direct. But it was there, unmistakable in the air between them. It was in the way Milo's fingers flexed against the cup in his hands. In the way Thatcher's knee rested just a little too close to his own. In the way time seemed to slow every time they locked eyes, even for a second. Eventually, Thatcher stood and walked to the window, looking out at the stretch of tracks ahead. His silhouette was outlined by the glow of the lantern still flickering outside. Milo watched him, wondering what he was thinking, if he felt the same pull, the same quiet ache just beneath the surface. When Thatcher turned, his expression was unreadable, but his eyes lingered on Milo a moment longer than necessary. He didn't say anything, didn't move closer, didn't smile. But something passed between them, a kind of understanding that didn't require confirmation. Milo felt his chest tighten, not from fear or nerves, but from recognition. This wasn't about recklessness or breaking rules. It was about two men, caught in a pause neither of them had planned for, realizing that something essential had surfaced in the stillness. A connection, unexpected, undeniable, and despite everything, despite the job, the history, the silent rules they both carried like armor, Milo didn't want to let that connection slip away when morning came. Not this time. The morning crept in slowly, almost reluctantly. Pale light filtered through the thin window of the cab, casting the inside in a soft, silvery hue. Outside, the trees remained still, wrapped in a cold mist that had settled sometime before dawn. Milo hadn't slept. Neither had Thatcher. They had taken turns resting their eyes, but real sleep had never arrived. Something in the air, something unspoken, had kept them both awake. It wasn't tension exactly, but awareness. The kind that buzzes just beneath the skin, alert and restless. The replacement part was finally on its way, a fact confirmed by a static-filled radio transmission that felt almost surreal after the quiet of the night. They would be moving again soon. The idea settled heavily in Milo's chest. Movement had always meant normalcy, control, distance. But now it felt like something he wasn't ready to return to. Thatcher sat near the console, the shadows beneath his eyes softer now, his expression unreadable but calm. He hadn't said much since dawn broke. Neither had Milo. They didn't need to. The silence between them had deepened into something almost tender. The train systems flickered to life slowly once the part arrived and was installed. Milo watched Thatcher work, his movements precise and unhurried. There was no rush. Neither of them wanted to name the feeling, but it was clear they were both aware of the clock ticking louder now. When the engine finally hummed with readiness again, Milo stood at the control panel, his hand hovering above the throttle. He hesitated. A part of him wanted to wait, just a little longer, just enough to stretch the quiet into something more permanent. But he knew better. The job was calling, the schedule resuming, the distance about to return. He glanced over his shoulder. Thatcher was still near the side door, one hand resting on the metal frame, the other curled into a fist at his side. The early light made the planes of his face look softer, almost thoughtful. Milo cleared his throat lightly. "I could use a second pair of eyes on the way to the next stop," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He didn't look directly at Thatcher as he spoke. The mechanic didn't answer immediately. Instead, he seemed to weigh the offer, not for its practicality, but for everything it implied. Eventually, he stepped into the cab and settled into the auxiliary seat without a word. Milo adjusted the settings, slowly pushing the throttle forward. The train eased into motion, the vibrations returning to the floor beneath them like an old rhythm rediscovered. They moved in silence. The stretch of track ahead was long, straight, bordered by quiet woods and low hills. The windows were fogged at the corners, and the sky above was still deciding whether to stay gray or break into sun. Milo kept one hand on the controls, the other resting loosely on his leg. He could feel Thatcher's presence beside him, solid and still. As the train rolled forward, the quiet between them became heavier, not uncomfortable, but filled with something unspoken and fragile. Milo knew that once they reached the next depot, this moment would end. Thatcher would step off, return to whatever route or assignment waited for him, and Milo would go back to riding alone, the train his only companion again. And yet, something had shifted. They both felt it, an invisible thread between them, pulled taut by the hours shared in stillness and night. It wasn't about declarations or confessions. It wasn't even about romance in the conventional sense. It was about recognition, about being seen, about not wanting to let go of something that had begun in the most unlikely of places. Milo adjusted the speed slightly and allowed himself to glance sideways. Thatcher's gaze was fixed on the horizon, but there was a quiet in his posture that spoke volumes. He wasn't just riding along for duty. He was present, choosing to be here, and that meant more than Milo could say. Minutes passed, then miles. The landscape rolled by like a quiet movie. Trees blurred. Fences came and went. And still, neither of them moved. Milo found himself wanting to say something, anything, to break the silence before it was forced to end. But what do you say when words feel too small for the weight of what's been shared? Instead, he let his hand shift ever so slightly on the armrest between them, not touching Thatcher's but resting close. The proximity said what he couldn't, and Thatcher, without looking, mirrored the gesture, his fingers resting beside Milo's in quiet acknowledgement. Not a promise, not a resolution, but a choice, however brief. The train continued forward, its path steady and certain. But for the two men in the cab, the moment between them was suspended in something more delicate, a truth not yet spoken, but deeply understood. And as the next stop approached on the horizon, Milo realized he wasn't ready for this to end. Not yet. The station came into view slowly, just a modest platform tucked between trees, with a rusted bench and a flickering light that hadn't been fixed in months. Milo had passed it dozens of times before, always with barely a glance. But now, as the train approached with its gentle lurch and slowing rhythm, the place felt different. Too real. Too final. The brakes engaged with a soft hiss, and the engine exhaled as it came to a halt. Milo sat still for a long moment, hand resting on the throttle, eyes fixed ahead, though there was nothing left to focus on. The silence in the cab was thicker now, not comfortable like before, but weighted with all the things neither of them had said. Thatcher rose first. He moved without hesitation, methodical and quiet, gathering his tools and slipping them into the weathered case that had arrived with him the night before. He didn't speak, didn't look up, just continued with the movements of someone used to finishing jobs and moving on. Milo remained seated, his hands still, heart thudding in a slow, steady beat that had nothing to do with the engine beneath him. It would have been easy to let it end there. Easy to nod, to say thanks, to offer a firm handshake and pretend none of it had mattered. That was the kind of ending Milo had mastered years ago. Clean, safe, forgettable. But something inside him pushed against that instinct. Maybe it was the way Thatcher had listened the night before. Maybe it was the way silence between them had said more than any words. Maybe it was simply that for once, Milo didn't want to forget. He stood and stepped toward the door as Thatcher prepared to disembark. The mechanic paused, sensing him behind, but didn't turn. His hand rested on the cold steel handle, body angled toward departure. Milo didn't ask him to stay. He didn't need to. The ache in his chest already knew the answer. Still, he spoke, quietly, carefully, not to persuade, but to acknowledge. What happened out there, it meant something. Thatcher didn't respond right away. He stood with his back still turned, the world outside the cab stretching beyond the open door. The early morning light spilled in now, brushing across the floor, painting it in the soft gold of a day not yet fully begun. Then, slowly, Thatcher looked over his shoulder, not a full turn, just enough for their eyes to meet. His expression was unreadable, but not closed. Not cold. There was no dramatic goodbye. No confessions. Just a shared, lingering look between two men who had crossed some invisible threshold and weren't ready to define it. Thatcher stepped out. His boots hit the ground with a dull thud. The wind pulled at the edge of his jacket, and then he walked across the platform, past the rusted bench, toward the small road that led back into the world they both had paused from for a single night. Milo watched until he disappeared from view. The cab felt emptier now, not just physically, but in the way quiet can sometimes feel louder after someone leaves. He returned to the controls and sat in the chair that had been his for years. Everything looked the same. Everything worked. But something inside him had shifted. He didn't start the engine right away. Instead, he sat in the stillness and let himself feel what he usually buried: regret, longing, confusion, and underneath it all, hope. A strange, tender hope that maybe this moment hadn't been the end of something, but the beginning. Hours later, the shift was over. He signed off, returned his logs, and left the depot in silence. But the space beside him in the cab felt occupied, even in absence, as if Thatcher had left behind something more than quiet memories. In the following days, Milo found himself reaching for that night more than he expected. Not the warmth of the cab or the coffee or even the touch of shoulder, but the feeling of being seen, heard, chosen. He didn't try to find Thatcher, didn't call in favors or search for updates. He waited, and one afternoon, just as he was finishing prep for another route, he found something unexpected in his locker, a small folded note. No name, just neat, familiar handwriting. He said it meant something. It did for me too. I'll be at Station 7 next Friday. If you're still thinking about it, come find me. Milo read it twice, then a third time, fingers curling around the paper like it might disappear. His heart beat faster, not with panic but anticipation. For the first time in years, the tracks ahead weren't about duty or schedule. They were chance. And as he stepped back into the cab, hands on the controls, he knew something with quiet certainty. Not everything has to be permanent to be real. Not every connection needs definition to matter. But some roads deserve to be followed.